Howdy all. We're about to get started there in a couple of minutes, hopefully, anyway. Just trying to sort out the camera issues. Not too sure what the crack is there. We're getting the camera up and running. All I'm getting is this bloody thing, so I'm trying to be troubleshooting it. So until then, I'll stay hidden in the shadows. Where are we at now? Boom, there we go, that's the one. Oh, absolutely beautiful weather outside today, isn't it? You kind of get a bit too used to that sunshine, and then this stuff comes back, and then you miss it. You miss that sunshine. Alright, out there in the hat box as well, I see convoluted tubules and Christopher L. N5B4B. And I was just trying to, I was thinking I might have been noob there for a second. I'm doing well, and I'm not low. You'll say that I am not low. As I was trying to play around with this bloody mic or video issue still. It's bugging me. I can actually hear the rain coming through the mic on my headphones, but I don't think it's coming through on your side. Sounds lovely. How's everybody doing out there anyway? How are you doing, convoluted tubules? How's the weather your direction? Boom. Forgive that stuff there, that's just me working away here, tipping around until this video gets started. Yeah, this should be an interesting one. I thought this would have started at 1:30 because they were going to give out the schedule for the forthcoming meetings, but now it's coming up saying it's in private session. It says the meeting's going to start at 1:15. I was really hoping that they would have got the meeting kicked off there at 1:30 and let us see what was scheduled for the forthcoming meetings. I don't know, is this the last one with speakers, and then the rest of them are going to be kind of formulating their report? Are they going to be publicly streamed? I don't know what the crack is there. We'll hopefully find out there in a while. Damn, this bloody video issue. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing this one as well. Convoluted, as a bit misty and rainy down your direction. Chilling and looking forward to hearing it. This one is going to be a big focus, it seems, on decriminalisation, the policies around that, how to put it into action. The speakers, are speakers listed below? No, they're not listed below. I have them over on the description in the video. Give me a second. Boom. Make sure I pause this shit in the background. Julia Hanna She's a researcher. She's kind of looked into the negative effects of prohibition, the benefits of decriminalisation. There's Bisi Akintoye. She again's kind of looking into the racial profiling that goes on in policing. So that'll be an interesting one to hear. Professor Julia Buxton. Jesus, was only reading about her there not just a while ago. Again, another researcher. Was it the? Jesus, let's just quickly put her up on screen. There we go. The Liverpool John Moores University. That was the one. I think the other one was Sussex. So there we go. There's a little bit about this lady, a Latin Americanist by background. Conducted PhD research in Venezuela and was an adjunct professor on the Venezuela Studies program of the School of Foreign Services, Georgetown University. Research, training and teaching activities have had an international policy and practitioner focus, including around themes of conflict, peace building, security sector reform and violence reduction. At Bradford University in 2000s, she ran and supported the delivery of the FCDO, Chevening and MOD programs, Swedish SIDA and Saferwood Conflict Help Desk, research consultancies for DFID, the USAID, Government of Finland and the British Council 3-year project. So she's done a lot of work, let's say that. And here it goes. I'm developing a national focus to my research, including through analysis of drug markets in the Northwest and drug-related deaths and drug distribution networks in Scotland. With funding from the Open Society Foundations, she has delivered short courses and professional training for Roma clinicians, drug policy reform advocates and policymakers in Hungary, Bulgaria, Brussels and multi-country, multi-partner research projects, including mitigating the harms of drug and drug policy on women, involving 4 international workshops, 4 training sessions, 2 author training sessions and the edited collection The Impact of Global Drug Policy on Women, Shifting the Needle, Emerald 2020. So yeah, this lady has done a lot of work, seems to be kind of focused on minority groups, focused on women. So again, it'll be interesting to see what's to be said there. The last one then, Marie Nougier, Head of Research and Communications, International Drug Policy Consortium. Professor Alex Stevens, that's a name familiar to me. And is that a good or a bad thing? I can't remember. I didn't get a chance to read into this fella there. Oh, we don't have action over here. Still not playing. Thought it was about to kick off there. Alex Stevens, I know, is he an advocate for prohibition? Oh, jeez. Or am I mixing him up with someone else? Is that the dude, Alex Berenstain? Is that another dude? Are they the same, different people? Am I mixing them up? Criminal Justice Alliance. No, that's him. Who's Alex Berenstain? So just out of fucking curiosity, that's Berenstain, American writer, reporter. Yeah, that's the guy. He's kind of a prohibitionist. Tell Your Children. That was the book I knew him around. So it was basically like fucking warn your kids about the dangers of cannabis, which fucking doesn't. I'm not going to disagree with the guy on that. I just disagree with his position that prohibition is the way to go, and that by legalizing it we're increasing the risks to young people. It's like, nah, lad, nah. But Alex Stevenson, again, it is a name that is Alex Stevens, a name that is familiar to me, as I've heard his stuff before through Hot Topics. I think it might have been in the past. One of those different events anyway that we would have been going along to during the time with the Students with Sensible Drug Policy. So there's not too many people in their positions that will be coming out pro decriminalisation, pro regulation, because it does come with its risks, as people have found out. Here's the profile. A researcher and teacher on the overlap between drugs and crime and public health, particularly interested in how policies in these areas are made and how we can improve them through research and collaboration with policymakers, practitioners, and directly affected communities. Like that's the one that annoys me, directly affected communities. Like our court system, right, for example, has a database on people who've been criminalised before the courts for the possession of drugs. Like, at what point did they engage with these communities that have been directly affected by our drug policy? Like, you know, by our drug policy makers. Like, come on, in fairness, like that's a low-hanging fruit in which they can engage with to kind of get a position and an understanding as to how these laws affect these fucking communities directly. And they don't do it. I wonder why. But this is the focus of his 2024 book on drug policy constellations. Yeah, constellations. This is, outside of the University of Sheffield, I am a trustee of Harm Reduction International and the Criminal Justice Alliance. I was previously a member of the UK Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs and the president of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy. I supervised the dissertations on these on drug policy, harm reduction, policy making, policing, and other issues related to illicit drugs. He also leads evaluations for government departments and other clients with a focus on realist evaluations using both qualitative and quantitative methods. He's developing the international study of policy constellations using methods including social network analysis and qualitative comparative analysis. Before joining the University of Sheffield, he worked 26 years at the University of Kent, where he was appointed Professor of Criminal Justice in 2010. So there you go, that's a little bit about Alex Stevens. And that's just got us up to the quarter to mark, which I do believe this is going to kick off there any second now. Can you hear that rain in the background? I can see it kicking off on the mic. Like, this mic is a little bit more sensitive to the other one that I was using, it seems. Sorry, what's happening in the hot box? What's happening, Bobby? See you're out there as well. Kamalu says, Martin, what do you think are the chances that after all this is over, government buries their heads in their arses and do nothing to help the problems discussed? And I wish I could say the chances were low, but like there's a lot of crap going on, and we're going to have a summer recess coming up. If they do manage to get this report out before the summer recess, I don't know, is that a good or a bad thing? Like, I can only think that it's a bad thing, really. Like, while I would welcome this report coming out sooner rather than later, I just think if it comes out before the summer recess, this is going to be a lot of crap going on over the summer period, and then they come back in September, and it's just kind of like, I will get to that later, because there's these more important issues to deal with right now. As, you know, they don't really see the issue, the topic of drugs, drug policy, drug fucking policing and all of that crack as being important.
Pleased to open the 23rd public meeting of the Joint Committee and the 7th session on our legal issues model. I want to welcome our witnesses today. Ms. Julie Hanna, lecturer at the University of Essex Law School and Human Rights Centre and Director of International Centre on Human Rights and Drugs Policy. Dr. Bisi Akintoye, solicitor and lecturer on criminology and criminal justice. Professor Julia Buxton, Professor of Justice Studies at Liverpool John Moores University. Ms. Marie Nougier, Head of Research and Communication at the International Drug Policy Consortium. And Professor Alex Stevens, Centre for Criminological Research at the University of Sheffield Law School. You're all very welcome. Before we begin, just want to do a note on privilege. I remind witnesses and members of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable or otherwise engage in a speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you'll be directed to discontinue your remarks. It is imperative that you comply with any such direction. I'd also like to remind members of the constitutional requirement that in order to participate in public meetings, members must be physically present within the confines of the Leinster House complex. Members of the committee attending remotely must do so from within the precincts of Leinster House. This is due to the constitutional requirement that in order to participate in public meetings, members must be physically present but in the confines of the place where Parliament is chosen to sit. In this regard, I would ask any member partaking via Microsoft Teams that prior to making a contribution to the meeting that you confirm that you're on the grounds of the Leinster House campus. As agreed, witnesses will each have 5 minutes to deliver their opening statements to allow sufficient time for questions and answers with members. If necessary, further or more detailed information can be submitted to the clerk for circulation to members. So now I want to begin, and now I invite Ms. Julie Hanna to deliver your opening statement. You're very welcome, Julie.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Chair, members of the committee, distinguished colleagues, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. My name is Julie Hanna. I'm a lecturer at the Law School and Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, and I'm a director of the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy, the only academic center currently dedicated to research and teaching on the intersection of international human rights law and international drug control law. I'm a co-author of the International Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy, alongside my fellow co-sponsors, the United Nations Development Program, UNAIDS, the World Health Organization, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm also a co-author of the recently launched Guidance Note on Decriminalization, alongside UNAIDS, the United Nations Development Program, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, and Release. I have had the privilege and honor to engage with governments and communities around the world in building technical, policy, and legal reform work towards rights-based drug policy. It's an honor to be here at what I see as a historic moment for Ireland as you explore democratic solutions to the harms of criminalization, particularly for marginalized communities. What I would like to do very briefly is to reflect on the significance of the task before you, to introduce 2 documents that I believe will be especially useful to your work here, the Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy and the new Guidance Note on Decriminalization, and then to offer one brief reflection on my work in Brazil on why decriminalization, important as it is, must be joined up with a broader vision of rights and social inclusion. What I want to emphasize at the outset is that this is not simply a technical policy discussion. Drug policy can often be treated as an ordinary matter of policymaking, legislation, enforcement, sometimes health services, and sometimes social programs. But to me, human rights are something different. They're not just another technical consideration. They're about real lives, supporting communities, and protecting human dignity. They offer you a deeper normative framework that should guide every policy choice that is made. And that is why it matters to make human rights explicit in this process. It's a way of framing drug policy, directing us towards what matters and away from what does not. It moves us beyond narrow technical language so we can begin to ask different and better questions. Does our approach protect dignity? Does it reduce discrimination? Does it respect autonomy? Does it minimize or eliminate coercion? Does it establish accountability and transparency? And does it help to build the conditions in which people and communities can actually live safely and in dignity? It forces us to ask, what do we value in our responses to drug use? Do we prioritize health and human rights, or do we allow outdated punitive models to persist? The answer to these questions will define the future of drug policy here in Ireland. For me, certain lines should never be crossed. These lines must be the human rights standards, not arbitrary drug control standards. And this is why the International Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy are important and useful to you. They're important not because they create new rights, they do not. They are important because they reflect and interpret the existing body of international human rights law in the specific context of drug policy. They help make visible what established human rights obligations mean in practice for law, policy, services, and systems working with people who use drugs and people in situations of social exclusion. The Guidance Note on Decriminalization is useful for a similar reason. It reflects decades of learning from decriminalization processes, many of which you will learn about today from my distinguished colleagues, in different parts of the world, and places that learning alongside current human rights standards and the lived experiences of communities of people who use drugs. It is a practical tool. It helps explain what decriminalization is, what it is not, and what foundational principles should guide such processes if reform is to be meaningful, effective, and rights-based in practice. One of its key messages is that there is no one-size-fits-all model for decriminalization. Different countries will take different paths, shaped by their own legal systems, their histories, and social realities. But even so, there are core principles that should guide these processes, like the explicit recognition of rights, non-discrimination, no coercion, participation, accountability, decriminalize all drugs, and respect the interdependence of rights. These are not abstract values, they are practical organizing principles. And that matters here in Ireland because what is at stake is not only the harms associated with drug use, but the harms associated with existing drug control policy. It is the documented human rights violations created by criminalization itself, discrimination, social exclusion, coercion, surveillance and privacy breaches, repeated unnecessary contact with overly punitive systems. And those harms are not distributed evenly. They fall most heavily on those already pushed to the margins, especially people who are homeless. So, if Ireland is serious about a public health approach and one that is based on human rights, which I hope you are, it's important to be clear about what that means. A rights-based response cannot simply mean attaching health language to a criminal law framework. If punitive control remains, then there is a real risk that punishment is simply relocated rather than removed, and the human rights risks and consequences will remain. A human rights approach also means that engagement with services must be voluntary.
Sorry, Julie, we're just going to have to stop there. You're a little bit over, and we just need to make sure we keep going. That's okay, but we'll come back and make sure you have enough time to finish later on. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd now like to invite Dr. Akintoye to give your presentation. You have 5 minutes.
Right, perfect. Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this really important discussion. So my name's Dr. Bisi Akintoye. I'm a solicitor and a lecturer in criminology and criminal justice based in London. I'm also a trustee of Release, which is a UK-based charity and advocacy organisation focused on drug policy, reform and legal advice. My own research was on empirical work on policing, stop and search and drugs, looking at racial disproportionality in the UK. So looking specifically at the intergenerational experience of drug policing on marginalized communities. So my central argument today is that the harms associated with drugs are significantly produced and intensified by the legal and policing frameworks through which the state responds to them. So in particular, current approaches rely heavily on enforcement practices that are both unequal in their application and limited in their effectiveness. In practice, this has produced a heavily enforcement-led system in which drug policing, particularly stop and search, has become one of the most routine forms of state intervention in everyday life for marginalized people. In the UK context, drug control is primarily structured through the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. So while this legislation was introduced with the aim of reducing harm, in practice it's entrenched a highly punitive, enforcement-led approach that relies heavily on police powers. Over time, this has shaped drug use as a criminal issue rather than a public health one. A similar dynamic can be observed in Ireland under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1977 as amended. So this framework continues to criminalise possession and supply and provides the legal basis for drug enforcement practices by the guards. So while there have been important policy discussions around these more kind of health-led approaches, the legislative framework remains fundamentally prohibitionist and enforcement-led. So the key issue is how this legislation operates on the ground and how drug policing is experienced by the communities it affects most. Drug laws provide a foundation for a wide range of policing powers. So in England and Wales, drugs remain the primary driver of stop and search, accounting for roughly 2/3 of all searches. In Ireland, while the legal powers differ, drug enforcement similarly relies on discretionary policing under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So although there's comprehensive ethnicity data is limited in the Irish context, existing evidence and oversight reports have raised concerns about the concentration of policing in already marginalized communities. This enforcement is not applied evenly. Black people are several times more likely to be stop and searched than white people in England and Wales, with disparities rising to over 7 times for certain types of searches. These disparities persist over time and remain insufficiently explained by policing agencies, despite the fact that survey data consistently shows that drug use rates are broadly similar across ethnic groups. In short, this disparity can't be explained by differences in offending, and instead it reflects how suspicion is constructed and applied in practice. Drug enforcement has long acted as a proxy for social control and racial governance, constructing the figure of the criminalized black subject as a threat to social order. These legacies continue to shape the assumptions, language, and practices of contemporary drug policing. So drug legislation emerges as part of a kind of broader legacy of racialized social control and social exclusion that disproportionately impacts minoritized communities. The disproportionate targeting of marginalized communities through stop and search practices for suspected drug possession, often without legal justification, is a contemporary iteration of this long-standing dynamic. Today, drug-related stop and search remains the most common use of these powers. So to put it simply, drug enforcement regulates populations, shaping who is subject to surveillance, suspicion, and intervention. Because drug possession is relatively easy to suspect but difficult to prove on the street, it becomes an effective justification for discretionary police intervention, often around the smell of cannabis. In practice, this turns drug enforcement into a key mechanism through which racialized suspicion is produced and reproduced in line with existing biases within operational policing. The consequences are significant. Even when no arrest is made, police encounters can be intrusive and stigmatizing, particularly for young people and vulnerable groups. When enforcement does lead to criminalization, the long-term impacts include criminal records, reduced access to employment and education, and deepening mistrust in state institutions. Crucially, these harms are not offset by clear evidence of effectiveness. The data is clear that more stop and search does not reduce crime, even as it draws scores of young people and vulnerable groups into the criminal justice system. More broadly, there's limited evidence, contested evidence that increasing drug enforcement or the use of stop and search has a meaningful impact on reducing serious violence or drug supply. Reviews should find that the effects of stop and search and crime reduction are at best moderate and highly variable, with limited evidence of sustained impact on serious violence or drug markets. This points to a fundamental problem. Current drug policy relies on coercive policing powers that are both unequally applied and demonstrably limited in effectiveness. From a policy perspective, this should prompt serious reconsideration of both policing practices and the legislative framework itself. Ireland has already taken some limited steps in the direction of moving towards alternative approaches. For example, Portugal's decriminalisation model, introduced in 2001, removed criminal penalties for personal possession and redirected individuals towards health and support services. Since then, Portugal has seen reductions in drug-related deaths, HIV transmission, and problematic drug use, without significant increases in overall consumption. In the island context, measures remain constrained and continue to operate within a broader system of criminalisation. The key lesson is shifting the underlying logic of drug policy from punishment to public health and reducing criminalisation and marginalisation. For Ireland, there is a clear opportunity to avoid reproducing patterns of unequal enforcement seen in other jurisdictions. Based on the evidence, there are several areas the committee may wish to consider. First, reducing reliance on policing as the primary...
Pardon me, Dr. Akintoye, we've gone a minute over, if that's okay, so I might just stop you there and come back to you later on in the session. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
No problem, thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Professor Julia Buxton to deliver your opening statement.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Julia Buxton. I am a Professor of Justice Studies at Liverpool John Moores University. I was also very fortunate to receive a 4-year British Academy Global Professorship. As part of the Global Professorship, my project was focused on the really dramatic transformation of international drug markets. The patterns of shift and change that I see in the international drug markets, I really date to the 1990s, the collapse of Soviet communism, globalization, and the emergence of the internet, really delivering massive external shocks to the United Nations post-war drug control system. And I think what we're seeing currently is fragmentation, diffusion, and digitalization, all deeply disruptive trends which were accelerated intensively during the COVID lockdown. These shifts, which we're seeing in the international drug economy, are creating major problems for all countries and for the traditional models of drug law enforcement, prevention and treatment services. But states are impacted very, very differently, and I think islands in particular have serious, kind of more complex challenges than land-bordered states, and so as a result of that, I did some of my research in small islands, including Iceland, Malta, and the very small island of the United Kingdom. So the transformation that we see currently currently underway. I hope this helps you contextualise some of the legal and policy changes which are being embraced by other countries. I'll just do this very quickly. First of all, looking at the supply side and the things that you really need to be alert for in Ireland. These real significant transformations in terms of supply and distribution chains and the organisation of supply and distribution. We no longer live in an age of cartels, crime group structures are evolving, and the organisation of drug crime is evolving. We no longer live in an era of Pablo Escobar, the Medellin king of cocaine, or Kun Sa, the Myanmar king of heroin. It's the end of these kind of hierarchical, structured criminal groups with the old bonds of discipline and loyalty controlling drugs from source to street and usually the state. What we have today instead are cartelitos. These are flat, agile, small, ill-disciplined, and they are essentially franchises. They are based around prison gangs, urban gangs, spread across Europe and Latin America. They're digitally connected, they're transnationalised, and they have diverse portfolios. They no longer focus only on the drugs, as used to be the case with the old cartels. They focus in particular, for example, on far more lucrative aspects of the informal economies: guns, gold, probably diesel right now, and also people. In this respect, drugs are simply not that lucrative, and I would like to emphasise at this point in time that we are seeing wholesale and retail prices at historic lows for the majority of the drug plants, primarily coca, cocaine, poppy and cannabis, opium poppy and cannabis, and we have record rates of drug plant cultivation. So what we're seeing right now, and the real danger that we're all facing, is these new crime group partnerships to shift bulk, high purity and very, very cheap cocaine. And one of the trends in particular I've been tracking has been the emergence of narco submarines in order to avoid surveillance and interception. This is linked to the second important shift, which is the rise of the synthetic markets. So what we're seeing is real competition between the plant markets and between the synthetic markets. And this is really changing the profiles of countries internationally. What we used to understand as supply states are now consumer states, and what we used to understand as the consumer states are now supply and trafficking states. And in that respect, I would certainly cite countries such as Ireland and the United Kingdom, which are now emerging as trafficking countries. Turning very quickly to demand side, social media dealing, the internet, crypto markets are radically transforming the way that people obtain their drugs and obtain their intoxicating substances. We're seeing record levels of drug use internationally. This is despite draconian and punitive anti-drug laws, but it should be stressed that the majority of people, as acknowledged by the UNODC, around 75 to 80% of people who consume drugs do so moderately and without causing harm to themselves or to others, as we see in alcohol markets. But the key trends we're seeing in terms of demand: increase of women's use of drugs, increase in polyadministrative and polydrug use, and also niche cultures such as chemsex, and online drug purchases are booming. So how are countries responding? I would say, in the very limited amount of time that we have left, lopsided and limited. And this is because, even though we do see what we consider to be some quite dramatic changes, for example, adult regulated cannabis markets in countries such as Canada, the cannabis clubs in places like Malta, all countries remain completely constrained by the UN drug treaties. So the changes that we have seen to date, whether this is in relation to harm reduction, whether this is in relation to legalisation, decriminalisation initiatives, these are all at the margins of the prevailing UN drug conventions. And as a result, I would argue that many of these countries are in a treaty trap. So whereas I'm happy to take all questions on some of these initiatives that we have seen, safe pharmaceutical supply, drug testing, decriminalisation, I do remain deeply concerned that these are actually creating new forms of exclusion and reinforcing the iatrogenic characteristics of drug policy. The harm caused is far worse than the problem.
Professor Buxton, thank you so much for your statement. I'd now like to invite Ms. Nougier to deliver your opening statement. You have 5 minutes. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, everyone, and many thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me? Yeah. So my name is Nougier. I'm the head of research and communications at the International Drug Policy Consortium, or IDPC, which is a global network of over 200 civil society organizations that come together to promote drug policies grounded in social justice and human rights. So over the past 2 decades, the ADPC network has been documenting the devastating harms of punitive drug control on health, on widespread stigma and discrimination in access to healthcare, education, and employment, and on high levels of violence and abuse against people who use drugs. In order to mitigate these harms, a growing number of jurisdictions have opted for alternative policy options, including decriminalization, which will be the focus of my intervention today. So globally today, 69 jurisdictions in 39 countries have now decriminalized at least one internationally controlled substance. And this is a trend in virtually all regions of the world. The issue is that decriminalization models vary dramatically from one jurisdiction to the other, and so do their impacts on public health, on human rights, and on social justice. In fact, some decriminalization models can be as or more harmful than criminalization. In Russia and Mexico, for example, the threshold quantities allowed are so low that the numbers of arrests of people who use drugs have actually increased after decriminalization. In other models, decriminalization only serves to perpetuate the historic targeting of marginalized and racialized communities. We have therefore identified some key components of what a gold standard of decriminalization should look like to avoid reinforcing prohibition narratives and to truly embrace a health and rights approach to drug policy. Our research also responds to some of the questions that have been raised in the report of the Citizens Assembly, which I hope will be helpful today. So the first question is, what should be decriminalized? From a public health perspective, we found that the models that proved to be most effective had decriminalized all substances and all drug use-related activities, including possession, possession of drug use paraphernalia, self-cultivation, and also social sharing. Second, what should be the response? The premise of decriminalization is the need to create an enabling environment to ensure voluntary access to systems of care and support. In our research, it quickly became obvious that any sanction can have a detrimental impact on people who use drugs, which can be particularly severe for those most marginalized who remain the target of police interventions. For example, the failure to pay a fine can result in further criminalization, which in turn undermines the purpose of decriminalization. At the same time, data from the UN has clearly demonstrated that sanctions have absolutely no deterrent effect on levels of drug use. So our gold standard is that no sanction should be applied. Thirdly, while access to health, harm reduction, and treatment services is absolutely essential, it's also important to recognize that people who use drugs may be facing a wide range of other issues and that they might need additional support to address these as well. And that can include housing, tackling gender-based violence, or childhood trauma. So this is the approach that was adopted by Portugal and others. The Citizens Assembly asks specifically whether there should be a limited number of times a person should be diverted to health interventions. The answer is no. And importantly, diversion should always remain voluntary. Evidence shows that coercive treatment does not work. Instead, ensuring good coordination and adequate funding for low-threshold harm reduction services and peer support will be important for people who may not be willing or able to enter treatment. Fourth, the decriminalization model should include the expungement of previous convictions for activities now considered as no longer being criminalized. Fifth, decriminalization requires training for a whole range of public authorities to ensure implementation and adherence, and that applies for both de jure and de facto decriminalization models. Sixth, it's absolutely critical to meaningfully involve people who use drugs in the design and implementation of decriminalization policies to avoid any unintended negative consequences. To conclude, it's also important to consider the limits of decriminalization. While it can result in positive health and social outcomes for people who use drugs and their communities, decriminalization will not be able to address the toxic supply that has caused so many overdose deaths in several parts of the world, nor will it address the harms associated with the illegal drug supply more generally, including the increasing levels of violence that we have recently witnessed in Europe and elsewhere. So alongside decriminalization, a serious conversation should be had around responsible legal regulation, a policy option that is now proposed and encouraged by various UN entities, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Development Programme, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nougier. And finally, I'd like to invite Professor Alex Stevens to deliver your opening statement. You're very welcome again back.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to all of you for this opportunity to talk to you about diversion and decriminalisation of drug possession. My name is Alex Stevens. I'm a professor of criminology here at the University of Sheffield. I'm a past president of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy and also used to be a member of the UK Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. I also co-authored a report for the Irish Department of Justice and Equality back in 2018 on alternatives to criminalisation for drug possession. In a previous consideration, the fact that it was 6 years ago suggests that drug policy reform is indeed a marathon and not a sprint. In my comments, I'd like to focus on the difference between diversion and decriminalisation, which are often confused. I'd like to briefly tell you about the results of a large evaluation of police-led drug diversion schemes that I recently led in England. My written statement includes some evidence on the effects of diversion and decriminalisation in other countries. I'll skip over them in the oral statement in order to save time, but I'm very happy to answer questions on the international evidence. I'll conclude by talking about the relative advantages and disadvantages of both decriminalisation and diversion, and finish with 2 recommendations for policy in both the UK and Ireland on these issues. So both diversion and decriminalisation can reduce the harms and costs of criminalising people who use drugs. And this is a very good thing because we are inflicting pain and punishment and cost without any justification for it. The harms of criminalisation of people who use drugs are not justified by any commensurate evidence in its effects in reducing drug use or related harms. So we have the opportunity to reduce those harms by diverting or decriminalising people. The difference between them is that decriminalisation removes the offence of possession from the criminal law. It's a de jure legal change. It means there's no longer a criminal offence of the possession of drugs, although it may still be an offence to produce, import or supply them. In contrast, diversion does not remove the criminal offence from the criminal law. Rather, it involves diverting people to educative or therapeutic alternatives instead of criminalising, prosecuting and punishing them. And we recently concluded a big study on diversion that was led by police forces in England. It included over 60,000 people who committed drug or drug-related offences, and we interviewed over 220 people about their experiences either delivering or receiving these types of diversion schemes. The main findings of our study was that diverting people who are caught in possession of drugs is more effective than criminalising them in reducing the risk of offending. So there was a 12% reduced risk of reoffending amongst those people who were diverted. Diversion is also cheaper than criminalising people. It saves money both by avoiding the costs of prosecution, but also because there's less cost in future because there's less reoffending. And we found in England that diversion is not being used as much as it could be. Indeed, only a minority of the people who were eligible to be diverted were being diverted, partly because police retained discretion and quite often chose not to divert people who they didn't consider worthy of diversion, even though they were formally eligible to be diverted. So when policymakers choose between diversion and decriminalisation, they can consider that diversion may be easier to implement because it does not require a change to the law, but diversion is more costly and intrusive than decriminalisation, and more intrusive, for example, of people's human rights to liberty and non-stigmatising treatment. That's because that law is still in place, and it leaves the opportunity still to be using the law to do the sort of things that Dr. Akintoye was talking about, which is to apply it in a discriminatory and stigmatising fashion. We should also consider that neither diversion nor decriminalisation address the harms related to the illicit supply that Professor Buxton was talking about. These harms will continue if we don't regulate the market. So having considered and researched these issues over many years and carrying out many research studies on them, I would like to make the following 2 recommendations, both to the Irish government and also because the laws are so similar to the UK government. The first would be to decriminalise the simple possession of any type of controlled drug. There are no benefits that we know of from the research from criminalising possession that outweigh its costs and harms. I would go further than that and also recommend the introduction of diversion schemes for people who commit other offences, largely thefts or low-level dealing, sometimes known as user dealing, that are related to their own substance misuse problems. If well designed and implemented, these diversion schemes for that wider group of offences can reduce the costs of dealing with these offences and increase access to effective treatment and social support, which is likely to reduce the reoffending and increase the public health outcomes of drug policy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Stevens. Okay, over to our members. You've got 7 minutes each for questions. Deputy Murphy, you are up first.
Yeah, hey, Guramaigov. Yeah, you'd need about 70 minutes to go back on an awful lot of that.
You have 7.
Yeah, no, I do realise. Professor Buxton, the old scenario of Pablo Escobar, where he controlled obviously every element of it, so very simple from a point of view of you take him out of it and you impact in relation to the supply. I remember seeing it was a documentary on probably Netflix or something. It was the idea of, it was some middle-level drug dealer that said his father had been a reasonably sized drug dealer and got 20 years. He said, on that basis of I'm operating lower key, if I get caught I only get 7 years. I suppose that whole idea that it all broke itself up, you know, it has been, here's the most agile marketplace in the world. Right, but I'm interested in relation to, right, if you could go into exactly what you mean, right, the treaty trap, and then you call them the cartelitos, and obviously that broken up situation and circumstance, but that hasn't meant in any way, shape or form, as much as they have entered the fray and many other businesses, they are still able to get a steady supply of drugs. So, like, you know, this problem isn't going anywhere from a knocking off supply point of view.
Thank you. Thank you. It's the treaty trap. What I'm referring to here is that our countries, we all remain part of the United Nations conventions in relation to drugs, the 61 Treaty, the 71 Treaty and the 1988 Treaty. And what you see with the countries that have so far reformed or attempted to, kind of adjust their criminalisation model is that they're still working within the international system of criminalisation. So the kinds of challenges that we see, I spent a lot of time in Canada. I went to a lot of the cannabis shops in Canada to observe, how people were interacting with them. But the reality is the majority of people who were using these cannabis shops were kind of white, middle-class, middle-aged people. The illicit market still continues to function, but the punishment is more severe for still operating in the illicit market when there is the option of a regulated market. So we see that a lot of these countries that have embraced some level of reform have also tightened up in other aspects, tougher trafficking legislation, and tougher other aspects here. So the treaty trap really refers to the fact that the 1961 Single Convention, to my mind, remains an obstacle to effective reform because it is a constant source for pushback for moral and opposition groups who don't want to see change to drug laws. So first, as long as we have the 1961 Convention and the conventions are unchanged, then countries are going to be able to reverse these reform trends and take us back to a criminalisation model, which I think is one of the greatest public policy failures of our time. Just in terms of the cartelitos, I think I agree exactly with the points that you've raised there, and Netflix has been a big introduction for most of my students to the world of cartels. But in terms of cartelitos, this is a term that's phrased by Bruce Bagley, and it's essentially referring exactly to this kind of fragmentation of these larger crime groups. But the bonds are not the same anymore. It's not the kind of same family loyalty or blood loyalty of this kind of thing. It's purely, economic exchange. So what we have are groups which are moving between the formal economy, the informal economy, between drugs, between gold, which is more lucrative for Latin American crime groups right now.
But you're getting that localised even in every, to the, let's say a successful guard operation, for want of a better term, takes a reasonably sized street dealer out. Generally he's replaced by 6 minnows and whatever else. So it's happening at every level and within it.
And it's accelerating. Yeah. That's the danger right now. The more police enforcement operations we have, the more we see this fragmentation and diffusion of the drug markets. And what we need to see is the Guard and the police in the UK actually evaluating the impact of these seizure operations in terms of violence, drug prices and drug-related harms.
No, because and the big thing, people still want to see serious, dangerous, violent criminals dealt with, but I suppose selling the idea of, and not overselling the idea of decriminalisation, that it's just you know, it's part of something that will hopefully work. Can I ask Mr. Stevens around when he's talking about obviously diversion? What sort of diversion program are we talking about that's like gold-plated, best practice? And even if you can take into account the idea that obviously criminal gangs, on the basis of the law, like, you know, engage really young kids through grooming and whatever. And I know you have organisations like Escape Line and whatever in Britain. And I'm just wondering, has anyone put anything in play that's having a real impact, you know?
The diversion schemes we looked at that dealt with drug possession offences were mostly using one-off educative sessions, and those could be provided in online settings. So that some of them were using online packages which people would go through. Some of them were using in-person groups, and so people would come, an appointment would be made, they would come to a group to discuss. The providers of these groups had worked out that it's not really very effective to have a general group for all drugs, because the needs and information levels that people already have are quite different between, for example, first-time users of cannabis and older experienced users of cocaine. So they've split out the types of education they're providing to people who are involved in these sessions. And our evidence we got from the interviews was that some people found those sessions useful. Some of them learnt things they didn't know, but many of the more experienced drug users didn't find much use in the sessions because they already knew about drugs and the harms. They'd seen some of the harms amongst their friends. They were fairly confident they knew how to protect themselves. So for them, the main benefit of this was not criminalising them, which is a good benefit because it's less expensive and it's more effective not to criminalise them. In terms of young people being exploited in drug markets, I mean, that's the thing. People have got very excited about that in recent years, but it's something that's been going on for decades. And it is important to remember that there's not a clear divide between offenders and victims in these markets. They're quite often the same people. People who've been exposed to violence at a very young age are more likely to become the violent offenders of the future. So we need early intervention that is supportive and not punitive of the children who are most likely to get involved in these markets, and punishing them for their first steps into the illicit drug market is likely to push them further into it rather than keep them out of it.
Correct.
Thank you, Deputy Murga. Senator Fitzpatrick, you're next.
Yeah, thank you all for your contributions. Citizens' Assembly's recommended decriminalising. It didn't recommend legalising and regulating drugs. So we have a significant challenge. And Ireland and the international perspectives are hugely valuable and, you know, really help inform our thoughts on this. But in terms of, you know, when you talk about the cartels and that in the international and the global context, I think that's really important that we do recognise how the world has changed, how drugs, how they present in our societies changed. But like yesterday in a suburban road here in Dublin, an 11-year-old kid picked up a gun that had been thrown by somebody who was escaping the Gardaí, who were pursuing the individual because they were a low-level drug dealer, probably. So it's everywhere. It's in all of our communities right across the country, and it's a big challenge. So the human rights argument for the drug user is very, very compelling, but there is a counter-argument as well here, and it's the human rights of the child playing in the street, the parent leaving their kid out to play on the green, the challenge to their human rights of that drug activity. And that's really, you know, a very strongly felt feeling by communities right across the country that their communities are being destroyed by what is low-level drug dealing, maybe, in the scheme of things, in the global scheme of things, but when it's happening right on your doorstep, outside your school, or in your local park, that's unacceptable. So it is very challenging. And our policing model in Ireland is quite different. to the UK and the US. Like we have one national force. I think in the UK you've got more than 40, and I don't know, it's thousands in the US, I guess. You know, there's multiple forces. So, and they're guardians of the peace. That's what Garda Síochána means. They're seen as the guardians of our peace. And they have been, and they say to us that we need to continue with diversion. We need to increase diversion rather than go the decriminalisation route. So I'm just wondering, have one of the diversion pilots that has been in operation here for far too long as a pilot, in my opinion, is the drugs treatment court. Have you looked at the drugs treatment court? Maybe Alex Stevens, I see you nodding there. And is that, when you say look at diversion and increase diversion as a recommendation, is that the type of diversion that you're referring to?
No, it's not, because drug treatment courts are post-court diversion, and what I was referring to more was pre-arrest diversion.
Okay.
And the issues you've raised are obviously real issues of concern, but they're not really relevant to the question of diversion or decriminalisation, because the decriminalisation that the Citizens' Assembly recommended would not affect the market for the illicit substances. It wouldn't increase it, because there's no evidence that decriminalisation increases drug use, and it won't reduce it because decriminalising possession doesn't address the harms of the market. So while those issues would persist, but would not be increased by decriminalising drug possession. What decriminalising drug possession does is respect the human rights of people who use drugs and reduce the costs of dealing with them and the reoffending that is caused by punishment, which increases reoffending. So I think we need to think separately about the harms of the illicit market compared to the harms that is done to people who are in possession of these substances, which those two sets of harms need to be considered separately, because decriminalisation doesn't do anything either to increase or decrease the harms of the illicit market. That requires a separate solution.
Yeah, and accepting that point, but I suppose what do you say then in terms of where the diversion happens?
Well, the diversion should happen as soon as possible in the system, because the earlier you divert people, the more money you save and the less harm you do to them. And the easiest way to do that is to de jure decriminalise the possession of drugs, so that people cannot be exposed to the harms and human rights abuses that both Dr. Akintoye and Dr. Hanna have referred to.
Joya has her hand up if you would like.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to react on the drug treatment courts, because this is something that we have been documenting quite a lot, in particular in the Americas, in the US, of course, but also across Latin America. And the conclusion from most of the researchers who have been documenting these is that they are quite harmful in a way. I mean, if you need to select a mechanism for diversion, it's not the one that should be recommended. It contains a strong element of coercion into treatment, which in and of itself is an issue, because you basically get people who use drugs into that system. And as we know, 1 in 10 people who use drugs will develop a drug dependence, so most of them will not need treatment. But you basically ask them, will you choose prison or treatment? Of course, they will want to choose treatment. So you are basically wasting a lot of resources into putting people who do not need treatment into treatment. There's also strong judgmental, moralizing aspect to drug treatment courts very often, which obviously is not helpful in a moment where we are trying to destigmatize and, you know, promote a social inclusion and health-focused approach to drug use. So from our perspective, really, drug treatment courts are not the right option. And as Alex Stevens says, you know, you would want a system that diverts people away from the criminal justice system as early on as possible. And drug treatment courts brings people into the criminal justice system. That is a long process. So it also wastes a lot of public spending for minimum outcomes in terms of health and social inclusion. So yeah, just wanted to put this out there, and I see others also have some thoughts about it.
Okay, thank you. Can we let the others in?
Yes, we are. Yes,
Thank you.
Dr. Dr. Akintoye, would you like to speak briefly?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I wanted to build a little bit on the point Professor Stevens made about the distinction between possession and other offences. I think something that really is key here in kind of the policing context is the difference between, police powers surrounding possession and those kind of surrounding supply and sale. So within the Misuse of Drugs Act, Section 3 relates to stop and search, for example, on suspicion of of possession, drug possession, which has a kind of low evidentiary threshold. The police also have access to Section 15, stops and searches for suspicion of sale or supply with a kind of higher evidentiary threshold. So in response to the concern about having the policing tools to deal with some of these issues that are affecting communities, which are very real and very serious, Section 15 already provides the guards with power to address the more kind of serious drug offending. So Section 3 isn't operationally necessary for tackling supply and kind of relates to your more sort of day-to-day possession offences. So keeping Section 3 is kind of fundamentally incompatible with the move towards decriminalisation. It essentially kind of enables routine, discretionary stops that rely on the discretion of police officers for personal possession. In practice, this functions as a kind of gateway for broader policing activities. So the police being able to use that power to find other sorts of examples of offences, but within this context of the kind of low threshold, high volume enforcement. So it expands police contact without addressing serious harm. And that's in contrast to the aims of decriminalisation that aim to reduce stigma, reduce criminal justice contact for possession. So Section 3 essentially preserves the policing of possession and enables this kind of more coercive state contact at the point of use, which would essentially amount to decriminalisation in law and criminalisation in policing practice. It's also inconsistent with, public health aims to, reduce stop and search encounters, reduce stigma in surveillance, and reduce the entry into the policing system. So the Section 3 offence in particular is structurally inconsistent with a more kind of public and health-led policy.
Thank you, Dr. Akintoye. Thank you. And Ms. Hannah, you.
Yes, thank you so much. Just to build and agree with everyone that has spoken before me, I wanted to just draw your attention to a few pieces of research that have been done around drug courts over the years. I think it's the U.S.-based Social Science Research Council put out a fairly comprehensive study on drug courts, urging governments to move away from that model based on the evidence that they reviewed. I think the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime has recently produced a publication around drug courts in West Africa. And from the UN human rights system, drug courts have been raised as a concern by a range of UN human rights mechanisms, including the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the UN Special Rapporteur on Independence of Judges, and of course the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly over the years cautioned against the use of drug courts because of the human rights issues that they produce and also do not eliminate. In Brazil, which I didn't get to reflect on a little bit in my opening remarks.
Ms. Hannah, I'm very sorry because I know I cut you off in your opening remark, but we're 4 minutes over time for Senator St. Patrick's.
Thank you.
But I promise you we will get onto that Brazil because I'm really.
Okay.
You can have remind.
Okay.
Sorry, Senator Nicole.
Thanks, Chair. Gurmil Magath. Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion, and Dr. Buxton, like your role, your job's fascinating. It's almost like not real life, talking about submarines and narco submarines and all that stuff. But the conversation around the treaty difficulties, realistically, then, like, what room for manoeuvre do we have in Ireland? Like, what can we actually achieve if we are constrained by that 1961?
Thank you for the compliment that my job was interesting. I think the real challenge is that there, at the moment, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the executive body of the United Nations, which kind of oversees drug policy, there is pressure for reform. There's a whole group of reform countries, mainly led by Latin America, which have been really trying to push forward change to the conventions. The challenge we have right now is that while we did see some initial progress in, discussions around whether there needed to be revision of the treaties, whether the treaties themselves should be scrapped, so we really need drug treaties, could we not instead allocate these responsibilities to development and the environment and different areas like that? But I think that progress in terms of revising the treaties has been somewhat slowed by the position of the United States, which was very confrontational at the last meetings of the CND, and as you'll be aware, a lot of the finances and funding for many drug projects have been cut, and the US has obstructed many of the debates within the CND. So is there space for Ireland to move? There is certainly space for Ireland to be delivering better than is currently the case, saving more lives, reducing the harm. Absolutely agree with the point that was made by the Senator before in terms of people want to see their children not exposed to the harm, but we're never going to be able to stop exposing our children to this harm because criminalisation is what's harm generating. So there is infinite room for manoeuvre for Ireland, but there has to be an almost constant process, I would say, of monitoring and evaluation so that we're sure that the changes that have been introduced are not creating more harm than good. So you have got room for manoeuvre, and please do take the opportunity, because the reason I came here today was just to say there is a storm coming, and so few of us are prepared for this.
Yeah, you say, that incremental reform is obviously insufficient. And what we don't want here is to be like a box-ticking exercise and to be, creating policy that just sits on a shelf and, is constrained, by existing legislation, be that here or in Europe. So what kind of a transformative approach can we, realistically and genuinely look for in a country like Ireland? And you mentioned also island states and the added difficulties that we have.
I think for some of the island states, I spent some time in Iceland. We did some research in Malta, which has introduced adult regulated cannabis markets and cannabis clubs. And I think the real challenge is, the offshore finance. It's, this kind of inability for many of these island states to be able to adequately patrol their territories in the face of these new threats, such as the narco submarines that we were talking about before. But I think where we can start with some of this is by focusing on things around, the transformative potential of some of these initiatives. And the challenge that we've had is, in so many country contexts, we had it up in Scotland, maybe here in Ireland, it's just like one project initiative. We'll have one safe injecting facility. And the challenge is that these are simply not transformational. They're underfunded. They become a focus for opposition to any of these kinds of changes. So I think the real focus at the moment has to be on training. It has to be about developing these alternative projects and how we can better evaluate and monitor them, as I said before. But the key thing is we just do not have the resources which are going in to be able to make the difference, and we don't have the people who are trained enough or resilient enough to be able to sustain these services. And so we're kind of introducing very, very small change, but that small change is very easily discredited or wrapped up and knocked back. And that's the situation that we're in at the moment. There has to be massive investment in transformative projects.
Senator, I'm conscious that Ms. Hannah has had her hand up, and also...
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, work away.
Julie?
Just very brief. And Julia might have mentioned this and I missed it, but there is nothing constraining you in those drug control treaties for decriminalization. They are permitted by the treaties. Well, there's sufficient flexibility built into those treaties where decriminalization is permissible. So you aren't constrained in that respect.
Okay, thank you. And I think...
Ms. Nougier has her...
Marie,
Marie.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to make the exact same point as Julie. So decriminalization is allowed within the conventions. What constrains you is when you move beyond decriminalization and go towards legal regulation. That being said, 300,000 people now live in jurisdictions where cannabis is legally regulated. So there is a movement towards legal regulation as well. That is very clear. And there are avenues under international law that would enable you to accommodate legally regulated regimes, and these are being explored by countries like Colombia, Bolivia, Czech Republic. So it could be interesting to have a chat with them on how they're trying to accommodate that, including through inter-se agreements. I mean, I can share some information on this. It's kind of technical, but it is allowed within the conventions. Another thing I want to highlight very, very briefly is there is a lot of discussion, as Julia said, in terms of the drug control system and how it's not working. And right now there is a panel of independent experts that was established by a resolution from the Commission on Narcotic Drugs last year to review the international drug control system and provide recommendations for improvement. So we should also follow that closely and see what kind of recommendations they come up with that could be helpful for the Irish context.
Thank you. Senator?
Great, thank you. And just in the time I have left, I wanted to ask Dr. Bisi Akintoye, I hope I'm pronouncing your name okay, just around the stop and search and, you know, in ideally reducing the discriminatory use of stop and search powers in certain communities. Have there been any examples or, you know, oversight mechanisms that have actually been effective in reducing the discriminatory nature of some of those stop and searches?
Well, something that kind of restricts our understanding of what it looks like in the Irish context is there's no consistently gathered and reliable data on ethnicity in stop and search. So in England, so each local force gathers stop and search ethnicity data. And that has shown consistently racial disproportionalities, particularly affecting young black people over time. And that's kind of mainly driven by drug offences, so drug possession, for example. So just in response to, you know, decades of critique of this disproportionate targeting of these communities, taking into account the impact that this has on, that extend far beyond the stop and search itself, impacting the feelings of identity and status and belonging of young people, freedom of movement, really eroding trust and confidence in the police and all those sorts of issues. There's been a rethinking of how to kind of seek accountability, greater police accountability, using those statistics, asking the police to account for why these disparities exist, taking into account issues around like operational deployment to different police areas. So you have, for example, these stop and search community groups that the police kind of work closely with. And so, you know, the police will present the stop and search ethnicity data and be asked to explain why there may be more people from one particular ethnic minority group being stopped and searched than another. So but that really kind of relies on that data being available, because, you know, you kind of can't diagnose the problem without understanding what the symptoms are. In the Irish context, that's very difficult because there is no reliable and consistent gathering of that data. So a lot of the data that kind of speaks to disproportionalities along ethnic groups in the Irish context focus on Irish travellers, for example, and to some extent black communities too. But that is really kind of relies on self-report data and survey data rather than something that's gathered by the police itself. So I think the kind of the first step here is having that data and being able to look at those numbers, being able to understand how this is influenced by operational decision-making, geographical profiling, the potential influence of stereotyping, which are all the issues that arise in the England and Wales context and tend to arise in, you know, have been documented in other, you know, other parts of the world. And without that data, it becomes very kind of difficult to understand how we begin kind of addressing these issues. There's lots of lessons to be learned in the context of kind of seeing policing as kind of this broader function of social control, which has arisen, you know, decade after decade, specifically in the metropolitan policing context. So in terms of lessons learned for Ireland, thinking about what kind of structural similarities there might be and how we might address those by, you know, trying to improve trust and confidence with the police, gathering that data, having, you know, the ability to kind of try and pursue police accountability and all those sorts of methods. But it's very difficult without having that data.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Niven. Senator Rowan.
Thank you, Caerloch, and thank you all so much for your presentations. I think they're extremely important at this juncture for the committee. We are nearing the end of our deliberations, and I think it actually, everybody kind of has complemented each other on some of those primary questions, I suppose, that this committee will grapple with in the next few weeks. And I might just summarise maybe potentially what I'm hearing in one kind of complete piece, and you can then maybe comment individually if you feel like this adequately represents what I'm hearing. And I'm really doing this with the future idea of recommendations just to make it easier to locate. So what I'm hearing is, obviously we know the constraints under 1961 and what came after that, but what I'm hearing is, and I believe obviously from my own history of work in this area, is within that we can still decriminalise for simple possession. within that, because if we look at other jurisdictions like Germany and stuff, we can at least move as far as cannabis in relation to social clubs, in relation to, there's certain restrictions that have been moved around those treaties. So that's still a conversation that's potentially up for grabs. Decriminalisation, a key component of decriminalisation in its truest form is to obviously remove the discretionary justice-led approach that comes with not only Section 3, but also with this current the current policy under the Department of Health, which is adult caution system effectively, which is still police-led, which is still discretion. And what I'm hearing then from Professor Stevens is, because I think people will paternalistically and safely try move to diversion as an option and maybe only partly hear what you're saying. So what I hear you saying is that even though diversion is there and some people will take up of it and it's cheaper, but that actually effectively in the UK, it's only being used really because there's a gap in the legislation and the legislature has been slow to actually decriminalise. So, local boroughs and jurisdictions have taken it upon themselves effectively to introduce diversion, and that it still is a very small, minute number of people because of discretion, because it's still on the statute books, and because it's not a universal, I suppose, application. And then maybe, which we could go into then, maybe Julie, if you could comment as well, is the human rights aspect is something I'm really concerned about when it comes to diversion. People sometimes automatically connect diversion with putting people in treatment, sending people to detox, mandating healthcare effectively. So I'm wondering if you could just maybe comment very briefly on the human rights implications for that. So that diversion is not another punitive approach, and sometimes people will kind of lead on to there. I think it's probably a paternalistic approach to, if we just, send people for help, well then they'll come off drugs, rather than seeing it as that's not what this obviously aim is. We're not here to force people to make decisions in any other way, but obviously to have services available to them if they want, but not punitively demand or punish people who don't avail of services. So that's just a kind of brief overview in my mind of where we're at.
Shall I step in on the
yes, please.
diversion versus decriminalisation issue, Senator Rowan? Yes, you're absolutely right that one of the main points I would like to make here is that diversion is not decriminalisation. Decriminalisation involves removing the offence of possession from the criminal law, and as Dr. Akintoye says, that would be in Section 3 of the Irish law, and it wouldn't. Removing the offence of possession does not limit the police's powers to intervene in offences of supply, production and transfer of these substances. The main advantage of decriminalising rather than diverting is that it's a lot simpler and cheaper to apply. If there is no longer an offence of possession, then you don't need to be sucking people into the criminal justice system and spending all that money in order to produce harms that are not justified by effects in reducing use.
Thank you.
Well, any else? Yes?
Ms. Hannah, maybe?
Ms. Hannah?
Yes, I'll just come in for a moment around the human rights dimensions of this again. And maybe I'll squeeze in a little bit of Brazil, but I won't say it out loud because I don't want to get turned off again. Okay, so for me, decriminalization can support rights protection, and it should be. If it's done well, if you follow the right kinds of principles, if you're explicitly seeking to pursue a rights-based approach. In Brazil, almost 2 years ago now, or a little bit over 2 years now, there was a Supreme Court decision requiring decriminalization. And it was of cannabis only as sort of a step one. And there was a lot of internal discussions in Brazil around what does that model look like? How do we make this sustainable? How do we respond to the issues that one of the senators just recently talked about, like the issues of public safety, the issues of families and children, the presence of the illicit market that isn't what everyone wants to see every day. And drug courts did come up in those conversations. They were discarded because they were very concerned about the human rights consequences. The issue of diversion also came up. It was discarded because of the human rights issues. And so what they have in essence decided to build and scale is an alternative model that is around promoting access to rights and social inclusion. So creating spaces across the country, they're called Centers for Access to Rights and Social Inclusion. We have abbreviated as the CAIS model. And they can look like a lot of different things. So for some municipalities, it is an expansion and an acceleration of housing first, because that's what a lot of these folks need, is access to housing. And I know resources is always a big issue. I don't know the issues around resources in Ireland. In Brazil, the Supreme Court decision opened up a massive seized asset fund. It was a very large amount of money that was able to be redirected to these social programs and basically bringing people closer to accessing justice, accessing their rights, whether that's housing, whether that's legal aid, whether that's access to better education, whether it's just safety for the day. And so they're building this model. We're building sort of a way to monitor and evaluate it, but using human rights as sort of key indicators and outcomes. So it might be worth, Lynn and others there, having some kind of bilateral exchange with the folks building that model in Brazil, and we'd be happy to facilitate that conversation.
Thank you, Julie. Well worth the wait for the Brazil conversation. Thank you, Senator. Deputy Burke.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for making yourselves available to do a presentation and for the work that you did in preparing for this meeting. Can I just ask Marie, in relation to her presentation, she spoke about that decriminalisation models can be as or more harmful than criminalisation, and then you go on and talk about at the end about. And finally, to conclude, it is important to consider limits of decriminalisation. I'm just wondering, looking at Ireland now, I mean, what do we need to be aware of if we go down the road of decriminalisation? What are the mechanisms we need to put in place so that if we do decriminalisation, it is the safest way, and what can we learn from other countries where decriminalisation has occurred?
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot of work in trying to identify what are the key components of decriminalisation and how they vary from one jurisdiction to another. And what we found, for example, is when you have a decriminalisation model, for example, there is what is the entity responsible for considering whether the person is caught with possession for personal use or possession for intent to supply. So you can have the police, you can have the prosecutor, you can have the courts. What we realized very quickly is it's always helpful to have the police make the decision, because that is the soonest possible that the person is diverted away from the criminal justice system, which is the principle of decriminalisation. If it goes all the way to the courts, then it leads to a system in some jurisdictions, for example, in Latin America, where people will spend 3-4 years waiting for the decision to be made, and very often they are they are put in pretrial detention. So then it beats the purpose of decriminalisation. So that's one point. What is the decision maker? The second one is, what's the sanction or what's the response? And in a lot of contexts, there are sanctions. In some contexts, there are no sanctions. For example, in Uruguay, there's no sanctions. And for us, that is an important model, because any kind of sanction can have a detrimental impact on a person's life, especially when they're in a situation of vulnerability and marginalization. So, for example, a person who is homeless will have a lot of trouble paying a fine, even if the fine is very minor.
I'm just wondering, looking at other jurisdictions, one of the important issues about support systems, and the question is about planning for that. Because if you don't have the support mechanisms there and the people, and for instance, one of the areas where we're running into difficulties in relation to getting an adequate number of staff to deal with, say, child support, One of the organisations here called TUSLA has major challenges in retaining staff. Likewise, in this area, I presume other jurisdictions would have found the same problem as regards getting staff to provide the support, but making sure that you set up a structure that can be supportive to the staff who are providing the help to those people who want to move away from addiction.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that is a very important point, especially when we're in a context with drastic funding cuts for harm reduction and treatment services. I think around the world, I'm sure Ireland is no exception. So I think the most important part here is to make sure that you don't establish a decriminalization model that is a very heavy model that requires a lot of resources, and it doesn't have to be. A lot of models are quite light and enable, for example, the police to be adequately tooled and trained to make sure that they know where are the harm reduction services and treatment services in the community that they can orient people towards, and this should be voluntary anyway, because you cannot coerce people into treatment. The evidence shows it doesn't work. So being able to provide these points of referrals without having a structure that's not too heavy and cumbersome, and that requires a lot of staff. And that's the problem with Portugal. It is a heavy model. The diversion system, decriminalization system through the diversion bodies, the dissuasion committees, is quite expensive and it's quite cumbersome, right? So there are different models that you can consider to make sure that this is not too much of an issue. And I see Julie and Alex have points to make, so I'm going to stop here to give them space.
I'm just wondering if others want to come in on this.
Julie is first, had her hand first, and then Alex.
Just very briefly, to direct you to the UNAIDS decriminalization guidance note, which has tried to centralize all of that learning, including the article that Alex has just shared alongside other studies that Alex has done over the years. And the sort of second part of the guidance note really looks at these technical aspects that Marie has has touched on in terms of the determination of offences, what the thresholds look like, and really tried to meld all of that learning around the world into a quasi-concise document. So hopefully that will be helpful for you.
Thanks, Julie. Alex? Alex, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. The issue's been raised about the social support that might need to be provided alongside decriminalisation, and Portugal provides a really interesting example of that, because its decriminalisation initiative in 2001 was deliberately not just about decriminalising drugs. It was about a programme of social inclusion for socially marginalised people who were using drugs. And so it went alongside introducing a guaranteed minimum income, a major housing programme, and programmes of employment support for people who have problems with drugs. And that was very successful. And as Marie says, it's a reasonably expensive model, but a study was done by Dr. Gonçalves and his team at one of the Portuguese universities, and they found that by reducing the costs of the criminal justice response to drug use, which is a very expensive way of dealing with drug use, the total social cost of dealing with drug use actually fell despite the costs of having these dissuasion committees and the increase in treatment and social support that came with them. So it's a question of shifting resources away from doing things that are both harmful and expensive to doing things which actually help people and are actually cheaper, and certainly cheaper in the long run because they produce long-term benefits rather than continuing this cycle of paying to produce harms.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, Deputy.
Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Thanks. I just have a couple of questions myself. Alex, you've referenced several times that diversion is not criminalisation. Can you tell us, kind of in its most simplest form, what exactly is diversion? Who is being diverted, what are they being diverted for, and where are they being diverted to?
So we're studying this now at the moment. There are 13 different forms of diversion that are being used by the police in England, so I haven't got time to go through them all.
It's okay.
The main difference between diversion and decriminalisation, as I said, is the decriminalisation takes away that offence of possession. And the main difference within forms of diversion are when they happen. And do they happen, as we talked about, at the pre-arrest point or later on in the criminal justice system? And as I've said, the further people go into the criminal justice system, the more expensive it gets and the more harmful it gets. So diversion that works at the gate, at the point where the police officer is in contact with the person who's suspected of an offence, is going to be the form that is the least expensive to provide.
And Alex, in the UK particularly, that wasn't state policy in relation to diversion. This was an initiative that was being taken up by the police themselves?
Yeah. So in England and Wales, chief constables and indeed constables on the street have operational independence, and they can decide how best to enforce the law in their area. And several chief constables, in consultation with their police and crime commissioners, decided that because of the evidence that was stacking up, that it would be more effective, more efficient for diversion schemes to be introduced in the area. And what our evaluation that's just complete shows is that was a good decision because it reduced the levels of reoffending and the levels of cost in those areas.
I think that's a really important point. I might just ask you to reiterate it. So in the UK, which I don't think is anyway a bastion of liberalism, the UK police in different jurisdictions decided that based on the evidence and the impotency of action that exists beforehand, that they went down a model of diversion themselves outside of any sort of policy recommendation from the Westminster or any other.
That is correct, but Westminster policy has caught up. So the current drug strategy, which was published in December 2021, the UK drug strategy, actually does endorse diversion, even though it doesn't go into much detail about it. We've gone into a lot more detail, and we found that diversion works in those police forces that took the initiative to create those schemes.
Yeah, it's really interesting because some of the other expert testimony we've had at this committee in previous weeks would be from our own Garda Síochána, our police force and senior members, who told us that if we were to remove Section 3, it would be their belief that there would be people would be selling drugs in kind of more quantities or whatever it was. They were fairly adamant that the removal of Section 3 would be leading to more prevalence of drug selling.
Section 3 is not relevant to drug selling because it's about possession. You have a different section of your law and similarly to us. And so myself and colleagues have made the argument in the past that in defence of decriminalisation, it doesn't remove the police power. Indeed, if we look at this example of Portugal, I've interviewed police officers in Portugal about this issue, and they were initially worried that by removing the ability to arrest people just for drug possession and then trying to work their way up the chain, that they would reduce their ability to intervene in drug supply. What actually happened in Portugal was that they were able to shift their attention from dealing with low-level possession on the street and intervene in the import market, which is massive in Portugal. And so after decriminalisation of drug possession, the amount of drugs actually seized actually increased because there wasn't a cut-off of supply of intelligence. There was better relationships between police and people who use drugs on the street because there was less fear of harassment. And the police were able to shift their attention to dealing with the large import scale of the drug trade rather than wasting their time dealing with petty possession offences.
Thank you, Alex. Just in terms of a final question, more broadly for anyone who'd like to answer it, in terms of the international evidence of different jurisdictions and states which have gone down the road of decriminalisation, is there any similarity in the first year, second year, third year in relation to any particular issues that you encountered, any particular problems faced? Is there best practice? Is there areas to avoid? I mean, what do we do on day two?
There are things to avoid, so I'll just jump in here because there have been a couple of bad examples recently. One around British Columbia, which you may have had discussed in your previous deliberations, and British Columbia and also Oregon both moved to decriminalisation, did it quite badly and now reversed it. And the main thing they did badly was to not have a system of social support in place that would be an alternative way of dealing with people who are using drugs and having problems on the street. So it's not just about clicking a switch in the law, it's about having an integrated system of social support that is non-stigmatising and open to people who have problems with drugs so they can receive supportive assistance rather than going through this constant cycle of being punished through the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Alex. Julia, do you want to contribute?
Yes, thank you. It was very, very quickly. It was just to say that I think the key aspects around the international lessons learned from decriminalisation, I think really pivots around thresholds, and if the thresholds are set too low, personal possession thresholds are too low, then that really can, kind of create this cycle where you have these constant arrests. So thresholds are important. Political leadership, I think, is the most important. If you haven't got consistency in political leadership, then I do think that these initiatives do tend to be very quickly rolled back and folded in. And just going back to the issue before about support systems, I think it is important to point out that not all people who are arrested or criminalised for their drug use do need support. Instead, I think we should be also thinking about how we lean into education and prevention, which is more around training and understanding safer drug use.
Thank you, Julia. And Marie? Marie?
Yeah, very briefly in terms of pitfall, because one of the experiences that some Australian jurisdictions have faced after decriminalising is they had put together a system of fines, and what happened was the police then was encouraged to stop people who use drugs and then fine them to fill in the funds, and so more people ended up being stopped and had go through like this fine system because of decriminalisation. So I think decriminalisation should also be accompanied with instructions to say people who use drugs are not a priority. We need to stop targeting them. We need to make sure that there is a system in place for them to have access to health and support. But police should not spend their resources targeting specifically people who use drugs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marie. And Julie, you have your hand up.
Yes, just speaking to the issues in Oregon, for example, I think one of the pitfalls is a lack of consultation with the communities themselves and really harnessing the wisdom and the experience and the knowledge the communities themselves possess. Not only the communities of people who use drugs, but the mothers and the children and the families that are also in these communities, and having a broader community buy-in to these processes. So when issues do arise, there is a broader church of people in support of these initiatives to keep these initiatives moving in the right way and not regressing.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, that brings my questions. So now we're going into round two now for the members present. We'll have to go back to the road. Deputy O'Murray, you have 4 minutes.
Look, there's a consistency, across the last number of meetings, and I think, in fairness, around that whole Section 3 question that the police force here brought up, I think they really need to have a conversation, with others who have actually offered decriminalisation, and maybe directly with police, and I would say specifically in relation to the Portuguese model and that idea of, because their argument always was they use Section 3 and they generally only used it for people that were known to them, so therefore they were making it, and in an awful lot of cases they were players, but I say that depended on guard by guard in the first place. But as has been said earlier, I suppose it's the type of decriminalisation that's required. It's a decriminalisation that accepts the reality you will still have an illegal market. There's not much point in decriminalising to some degree unless you're actually going to get the benefits of it. And well, rather than me slobbering on about what I think, I'm just literally going to ask one or two if they could come in. It's in relation to where it's been operated best, and it's that idea of an effective decriminalisation scenario, accepting that we need wholesale supports, we need to deal with the issues of poverty anyway, but it's really just, I'm looking at a sales pitch in relation to decriminalisation, and then the ineffectiveness of what we are doing here and what is still being done in an awful lot of the Western world. So who wants to put their hand up?
Can I jump in with the Czech Republic as an example? So the Czech Republic decriminalised the possession of drugs back in 1991 on its way out of the Soviet bloc as a sort of signal of it becoming a liberal democracy. And it's very rarely discussed in more Western discussions of decriminalisation. I think it's partly because it's been so unproblematic. There has been some domestic discussion of it, and there was an attempt to increase the sort of tightness of restrictions, and that was evaluated and showed not to be effective, and again to increase these costs of policing. So they went back to a more liberal approach to decriminalising, and it was done by removing the offence of possession for a reasonably generous amount of use of drugs for personal possession, and they're now thinking of going beyond that approach. So I think a lot of the international attention goes to Portugal because it's such an intriguing example, but there are more simple ways of doing decriminalisation, and the Czech Republic provides a good example of just saying under a certain threshold, we're not going to arrest and punish you for the use of drugs.
Dr. Akintoye, would you like to come in?
Thank you. I would, and I'd like to answer slightly the inverse of that question, which is what it looks like if we keep Section 3. Yeah. So in the UK context, we know that these drug stops and searches for possession really drive this proportionality, race-based, class-based too. So we have evidence in England and Wales that shows that you have these examples of then a low threshold for police suspicion, plus police discretion, plus kind of targeted policing in certain kind of high crime neighbourhoods, which will tend to be structurally disadvantaged neighbourhoods, that leads to unequal outcomes. So like I mentioned earlier, while Ireland lacks that ethnicity data, we have these kind of same structural inequalities, the same structural conditions exist. So as I mentioned also, the guards aren't required to record race and ethnicity in their stop and search encounters. So while it makes it difficult to measure how Section 3 actually does impact people in different sectors of society, it still kind of points to this kind of unfairness and disproportionality and highlights the impact of this weak enforcement. So I guess the key point is the absence of data is not the absence of risk. So the data that does exist shows that policing is geographically and socioeconomically concentrated, impacting the most marginalised members of society. In the UK context, it tends to be kind of black working class communities, and it's in Ireland it's different. But we do tend to see these disproportionalities emerge as the result of these kind of low evidentiary threshold, discretionary police powers. So that kind of that officer discretion is something that's really key here. So just to emphasise that the importance of distinguishing between Section 3 and Section 15 as a way of sort of trying to tackle some of these underlying inequalities.
Okay, brilliant. Marie, you for your hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to expand on what Alex was saying on Czechia. The second point that was really important there is that they conducted wide consultations with people who use drugs in communities when they set up the quantity thresholds. So Czechia for that is a very good example in this regard. Another example I thought was interesting in the research that we conducted is the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, it's a de facto model, but it's been implemented since 1976. So they have very broad experience, so there's no questioning of that model. It's a very lean model, and it's a model where the police completely deprioritizes people who use drugs. And so that creates the conditions under which people who use drugs are able to access the systems of care and support that they need. These systems are well funded. And there's a lot of peer outreach as well, because also it is decriminalized, so people can actually conduct that work without fear of being punished. So that is a very interesting model, which I would encourage you to have a look at.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy. Senator Rowan.
Thank you. I just want to thank, I suppose, Bisi for her last contribution there. I think it's really helpful and really adds so much more strength to the debate we're about to enter. I think I will die on the hill of Section 3. I'm never going to let it go. I grew up in a community that Section 3 was used and abused and used and abused on. And, we also have Section 3 in the Drugs Act, which also allows you to stop and search a person or a vehicle or an aircraft or a submarine without a warrant. But you have to have reasonable suspicion. And that's the difference here, and I think we need to put it on the record, is the difference between Section 3 and the other sections that are for stop and search is that you have to have reasonable suspicion. You have to be able to say why and for what reason you have stopped and searched this individual. So for me, to maintain Section 3 is not only reducing the capacity and skill set of An Garda Síochána to have a power that allows them at will and at whim profile who they stop and search, because they do not have to say with reasonable evidence why they done that. And I just think that as a nation and as a society, we should expect guards to have that level of insight, intel, planning, whatever it is, to be able to stand over why they stopped and searched someone. I also think to remove Section 3 is going to radically address the tensions between some communities and on Garda Síochána. Because when I was growing up, we were so sick of being stopped and searched without reason, as children as well, so underage, so right from that age, where when you seen a guard, didn't matter that you hadn't got anything in your pocket, and it didn't matter that you never had anything in your pocket all the other times that you were stopped and searched, you ran, and they ran after you. And then you'd be arrested for running. But it was a form of resistance. It was a form of, here we are again, being stopped and searched, I'm not doing it, run. You still had nothing on you. And the cat and mouse, us and them, tension that creates, and that resistance and that hatred, because I never stood in my community and said, oh, here's the keepers of the peace. Do you know what I mean? And like, if we really want to stand over that as what the Garda Síochána means, we need to remove lazy policing that Section 3 actually entails, not only for adequate decriminalisation, but also for communities that have been abused by this section for absolutely everything and anything, even when it has nothing got to do with drugs or the possession of drugs or the suspicion of the possession of drugs. So there's not really a question in that, but I just want to thank, I think you have renewed my absolute rage in relation to Section 3, so I just really want to thank you for your contribution, but there is a minute there if anyone does want to comment.
I'd like to comment, and I feel your rage, Lynn, and I completely agree with you. You know, these drug laws are really a tool of these unequal outcomes, and that criminalisation legitimizes these really harmful impacts on all sorts of communities. You know, they vary from place to place. So there are lessons to be learned from the terrible example that Britain has showed. You know, the UK really demonstrates what happens when criminalisation and policing are left unchecked. You see these entrenched disproportionalities along, you know, class, race, religion, ethnicity lines, despite these similar patterns of drug use. So, I mean, you know, Ireland has this really clear opportunity to avoid reproducing that model. Now, thinking about how you know, deviating away from criminalisation can improve trust and legitimacy in the police, how it can reduce stigma and criminalisation, how it can reduce cooperation with the police, cooperation and reporting. As you say, Lynn, you know, a lot of communities who, you know, who have such a hostile dynamic with the police, they, you know, when they see the police, they end up running, not because they've done something wrong, but because that lack of trust is so deeply entrenched. They're so scared of being targeted. That's not a system that works well for anyone, not these communities and not the police. So we have an opportunity here to try and address some of these really, really deeply embedded hostilities by making some changes in the legislation here.
Thank you.
Okay. Unless there's anybody else that wishes to contribute. Okay. Well, just, yes.
Sorry, can I just add one thing there, which was really just going back to, I think one of the key things the international experience has shown us is that the police are such vital stakeholders in these debates, and if the police aren't on side with the changes that, you know, governments want to introduce or local authorities want to introduce, it can be a real challenge. But I think the debate really needs to be kind of pushed back, because I think what we're seeing in terms of these shifts in drug markets requires us to better understand what the policing skills of the future need to be. And really, you know, the policing has been so locked into, you know, the plant materials, the interceptions, you know, kicking down doors, those kind of things. But this is completely being transformed now. This is about economic crime, it's about digital crime, and so we really need to better understand what kind of skills policing needs for the future in terms of the types of drug problems we're going to have for the future.
That seems like a really good place to leave it. So on behalf of the committee, I would like to send our absolute thanks to all of our witnesses for your contribution today. It was an incredibly interesting session, and it will add hugely to the work of this committee. So Julie, Bisi, Julia, Marie and Alex, thank you all so much. Our next meeting is on the 21st of May, and I'll see you all then. Meeting adjourned. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
guys. Good luck. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And there you go. That was the latest edition of the Committee on Drug Uses meeting. a great meeting, to be fair. Some fucking excellent knowledge being dropped, some excellent facts from these experts in their different areas. Like Alex Stevens, like the man has a long history there, a lot of experience, and the other speakers also. So it's an absolute, the crime will be if these people are not listened to. The past few meetings, geez, the last 5 or 6 meetings, like that, they couldn't make it any clearer that prohibition is not working. Prohibition is doing harm. Our current drug policies are doing more harm than the actual substances themselves. Oh man, it's just like, how many more times can you explain it to people, and how many more different ways can they be shown that prohibition doesn't work, that what they're doing is actually counterproductive to what their aims actually are. Oh, like Lynn said there, like, this is absolutely infuriating. It does, it just brings about rage inside you as to, like, how can this be for so bloody long? How can so much harm be done so needlessly? Like, it just really does. The first-hand experience I have that, like, it's just really, really annoying. So many times stopped and searched by guards, like, just so much vulnerability that I was put through. I was needless. It was like, I was vulnerable enough at the time, going through enough challenges, traversing being a dad at a young age. And between the ages of 18 and 21, I was easily stopped and searched probably about 100 times. Found in possession, I think, in that period, about 7 or 8 times. It's ridiculous, it really is. And you've no protection there, like, you've no way to actually go and say to somebody, hey, I'm being fucking harassed by the guards, because there's no record of them stopping and searching you. Like, you don't get a receipt upon completion of the search and stop and search to say, hey, yeah, we stopped and searched this fella there the other night and he was found with nothing. Do you know? It's not. The first time I got caught with stuff, it was in me starlet, and I reckon from that moment on it was flagged. And as soon as they seen the reg, it was just being pulled in and stopped and searched, because that was the one I got stopped and searched in the most. It was ridiculous. Nice and everybody for your comments there throughout. It's been great, the back and forth there between everybody in the hot box. Big Hawk saying there, sorry. Oh yes, talking there about earlier about an excellent point in his opinion about how you take people off the fence, make it a human rights issue, ask them to calibrate their noses and show the QC check. I'm mentioning there as well, Mary seems to be talking sense from what I can see, and that was annoying me as well, because in the first few meetings, which weren't very pro decrim, they were very much pro prohibition. Mary was actually asking very good questions. She was really challenging the narrative, and I think, in fairness, maybe in defence of Mary, that she does that. She kind of plays devil's advocate. She questions what it is that these people are saying, not because that she doesn't believe what they're saying, but by questioning it and challenging it, you can believe it more, maybe. It's not that you're just disagreeing, you're just challenging it. So maybe in Mary's defence in those last few meetings, where I've kind of been a bit like turned off Mary, because her questions and her positions were fucking terrible, to be fair. Maybe that's it. She's just, what is it? Straw manning these arguments that have been put forward. And if that's the case, fair play to Mary, because that's probably what should be done, in fairness. Because obviously my position here is very biased. And most years out there as well in the audience, we're probably all very much pro-regulation, pro-decrim. So it's very easy for us to kind of see anybody who's not on our side as to being the enemy. So I'll go back and, in defence of Mary, saying, fair play, she's probably doing the right thing. They're challenging these people's position, only then to strengthen it. Because if you can't have your position challenged, then what credibility does it actually have? What's the solidity of the ground in which it stands? If you can't have it challenged, then it's not very solid, most likely. Big Hawk, not a bother at all. It's always good to be on here. Nice one for the company. Scrapping stuff, rashers, convoluted tubules, everybody out there. Legends for coming joining me here on these meetings. It's a pity we have to wait so long now for the next one. It makes me even more gutted that the first 15 minutes were a private session where it said that they were discussing the schedule of the meetings. So it's a pity. I might reach out to the members actually of the committee and kind of get a bit of an update as to what's going on there, what is the schedule, as we are encroaching on that fucking summer recess date. What's going on? What's their thoughts on when the report will be published? It'll be interesting to find out that. Wiedebeck says at one point, I think Hawk got Lynn and Mary mixed up. Lynn was wearing pink today, correct? Oh, forgive me if that was the case. I remember fucking Mary is being dressed in a kind of a pinky clothes. Maybe she wasn't today. I'm just placing it was what it was from the last day. So yeah, it could have got mixed up there, and that was probably my fault. Because yeah, you would see Lynn on her phone there from time to time. They're all on their bloody phones. I was thinking at the beginning, that those few that are there on the Zoom meeting or whatever it is that they're using, with their videos off. Are they just checking in? Oh, I'm here. Yeah, turn the video off, and then the F's off, and is cooking dinner or doing whatever there in the background, and not actually sitting there listening, but they're checked in. They're probably not cooking dinner actually because they have to confirm that they're on the Leinster House grounds, isn't it? But anyhow, grand old gig for them, soft money. So yeah, that's it. It was a positive meeting. Anyway, overall, get great contributions again by the experts that they've brought in, and I can only hope, for the best from this report. But like others out there in the hot box, Lynn probably ordering a 50 pack. Crack me up, lads. But yeah, as I was saying, like others in the hot box, I am a little bit pessimistic as to what all this kind of results in. It's we've been here so many fucking times before. The last Oireachtas committee, the last the Citizens' Assembly, and then nothing done off the back of it all. Please God, they do something, and if not, guys, it's the fact that they're doing nothing is actually it says more about us as a community, as a fucking country, that we're letting them get away with it. We really are. I mentioned the fact that civil disobedience there really gets their attention, and maybe we propose to have the next big smoke up down at the oil refinery there in Whitegate. Could be a big bang. Jokes, obviously, but you see what happens there when people get together and they unite. Those in power become afraid of those with the power, and we can't forget that. We are the people with the power. United we stand, divided we fall. We see it there on 420, on a number of years above in the Phoenix Park, where we had hundreds of people above there, all sitting around consuming, sharing, using cannabis in front of the Gardaí. They're just walking amongst the crowd and doing nothing. They didn't search anybody. They didn't seize any of the cannabis that was openly there on display. As people were kind of passing joints or sharing, a grinder between each other. They weren't stopping them and doing them for supply as they could have. That's what the law that they were breaking then is. And why they didn't is because, there's power in numbers. And when we come together, their power is taken away. Our power is kind of shown to us. It's just a pity that we don't do that more often. And I just really hope off the back of this report, if there is something strong coming out from this report, calling for decrim, calling for regulation, that we do as a community get together and push the hand of the policymaker and make them make it happen. Don't let them get away with just sitting on the hands, just kicking the can down the road. Freaking the next minister there will sort that out, Because I joined late and I think I got the people mixed up. I'll be emailing my local TD this evening in reference to today's meeting. It's good to hear, because the more people that we can have doing that out there, the more pressure that we can get on these people, the better. And as I say, our community definitely needs to be united. The grassroots social club is just one of a couple of things happening out there to make that happen. The grassroots social club, an online community of people bringing offline social events, So we've had a couple of events that have happened already. Port Arlington being one, the AGM that happened last year, and there's an upcoming AGM as well also this year. We'll be organising other offline events, social events to bring together our community, our members, so that you can socialise and so that we can organise also. So do follow that group if if not already doing so. Who else is out there? Cran, CRAINN. That's another online group. We've not seen a whole lot from them there lately, but hopefully they'll be back active if they're not already doing so, and I'm just missing it because obviously I can't see everything that's going on out there. Yeah, fucking Weedabeck says next meeting is in 3 weeks. We'll be strung out by then. I'll do my best, Weedabecks, to satisfy your needs so you're not strung out by then. I'll hopefully be getting on for a couple of streams between now and then. Maybe do a 420 news or two, or maybe even get somebody on for an old interview. See what's happening out there. I know Futures Green has probably got a lot to say. Casa, das Drogas out there, Grams DB. I know there's a couple of others who probably, it'd be great to get them on just to have a bit of a discussion about what's been happening over the last couple of months with these Oireachtas drug use committees, about people's thoughts, feelings, opinions, and what's actually going to happen going forward, about maybe when things might happen, if things might happen. You know, I want to do my best to try to keep the spirits of the community high. You know, I hate admitting my pessimism around some of these things, I really do, but I have to be honest when I'm on here as well, so I will admit it. I'm very optimistic, but I do have some pessimism in there too. So again, everybody out there, nice one. Thanks very much for joining me in the hot box, sharing your thoughts, feelings, opinions, watching these videos afterwards, leaving comments and all of that stuff, guys. I really do appreciate it and all of the support that you have shown me over these last few years. Keep it coming, and I'll keep it coming to you too. So until next time, stay blazed out there, guys, and keep her lit. Much love. Peace. I'm actually waving here to the camera and the camera's not even picking on. Stoner moments. Good luck, everybody.